Episode 2, Into the Wilderness, Mystery and Atonement. In the last episode, we looked at the question of justice from the point of view of those who suffer for being just. Our texts presented the timeless human question, why do those who try to live good lives so often seem to suffer unfairly? Why does the God of justice not protect them? But there is another timeless human question which complements the first. What does God, or the universe, have to say to us when we commit injustice? We saw this question arising in the opening scene of Plato's Republic. The old man Cephalus starts to remember all the things that weigh on his conscience as he approaches death. He begins asking the question whether judgment and penalties, or indeed rewards, await him after death. There are powerful emotions at play around this question. One is a consciousness of failure and of responsibility for that failure, of a guilt that becomes a psychological burden. And this overlaps with a fear of due punishment, whether in this world or, if I've got away with stuff, in the next. That simple fear of punishment intertwines with a more complex fear of a disruption of the relationship with God or with intermediate divinities. The fear now is of the consequence not of a particular harm done to a particular person, but of the consequences of disobedience towards a higher authority. Here, infringement of sacred law can entail loss of favour and protection, leaving the transgressor exposed to divine anger or the whims of malevolent demonic powers. On this emotive boundary, an act of injustice which could be settled by human jurisprudence becomes a sin, an offence against the person of a divine judge and patron. And related to such guilt and fear arising out of ethical failure is shame. Not only have I failed to live as commanded, disobedience, or as I know to be right, guilt, but I have failed to meet the expectations of those around me. I cannot look them in the eye, and sometimes they cannot look me in the eye. I cannot take my place as an equal. Even when they try to be polite, I know that they know that. The Greek playwright Sophocles explores this complex of emotions 4.5 centuries before Christ, particularly in his 3 plays based on the Oedipus legends. Oedipus is the man fated unwittingly to violate 2 ancient taboos. He will kill his own father and take his own mother as wife. The play Oedipus the King begins with Oedipus, the new king of Thebes, facing a plague sent upon the city of Thebes by the gods. The plague, he discovers, is due to the presence of a cursed man in the city. Oedipus, as he embarks on a journey to identify the cause and save the city, finds himself retracing the steps of his own life. But in the process, first his wife Jocasta, and then he himself realizes that he is the man the gods have named. He has fulfilled his cursed destiny without realizing. The fact that Oedipus has committed his sin by mistake does not exonerate him from the curse it brings. He expresses his own horror at what he has done by blinding himself. The play ends with Oedipus being cast out of the city, a blind beggar, an object of horror and pity for the onlookers. At the end of his life, Sophocles returned to the Oedipus legend. In Oedipus at Colonus, he presented a mysterious resolution to the story in a strange moment of redemption. The old Oedipus, after lifelong wandering as an outcast and guided by his daughter Antigone, arrives on the outskirts of Athens. There he is fated to find welcome and a release from the burden of sin. He arrives at a grove sacred to the Furies, the goddesses of primal retribution. We witness his shame as he is forced to confess his identity and tell his story, a story that both fascinates and horrifies his hearers. The play ends with a mysterious theophany. Oedipus, finally accepted by the king of Athens, enters into his final resting place, unburdened of the guilt and shame of his two terrible sins. The one who was most cursed mysteriously becomes a blessing for the land that received him. Sophocles' two plays chart a long and painful pathway through the guilt and shame of a terrible polluting crime to a strange purification and release. The language of sin can be difficult in the modern West, especially when applied to sex. People may struggle with the idea of divine obligation or divine retribution. Nevertheless, most of our contemporaries still have clear ideas about right and wrong. We will hold that people are answerable for their actions. The people of our time can still recognize the psychological burdens of guilt and shame carried by those who are conscious of personal or social ethical failure. The Oedipus story still speaks to us and raises a timeless question. How can we be free of such burdens? The middle three books of the Torah, supplemented by Deuteronomy, offer a compilation of regulations that present one ancient systematic response to that question. Legislation for crimes against fellow Israelites, foreigners, and slaves interweaves with sacred legislation enjoined in obedience to God. Reparation for social disruption is matched by rituals of the temple and of the home to restore the relationship with God and to free from ritual pollution or other forms of impurity. Modern Judaism preserves the ancient legislation, even though there is no temple to offer sacrifices in. Thus, just after the beginning of the Jewish New Year in late September or October, observant Jews celebrate the Day of Atonement with fasting and communal prayers. The prayers reflect trust in the God of Israel, who has given a law to live by. And they ask for forgiveness and mercy for any failures on the part of the whole people in observing that law. The liturgy has been a liturgy of the Word for most of the last 2 millennia. But the readings for the day from the book of Leviticus root that liturgy of the Word in one of the most solemn ceremonies from the days before the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD. The rabbis who recrafted Jewish practice after the disaster of 70 AD drew on the experience of exile in Babylon hundreds of years earlier. They proposed ways of observing the Torah faithfully in a world without a sanctuary. They could preserve the memory of the rituals prescribed in Exodus and Leviticus liturgically, even though these could no longer be physically practiced. By the mid-2nd century, they had compiled a text known as the Mishnah that collected the opinions of a host of rabbis commenting on each commandment of the law. Amongst other things, the Mishnah preserves a detailed memory of how the rituals of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, were actually carried out before the temple was destroyed. The rabbis describe how the high priest, after a night spent in vigil and fasting, would sacrifice a bull on behalf of himself and all the members of the priestly family of Aaron. They then describe how 2 goats were selected by lot, one dedicated to the Lord to be sacrificed in the temple, and one dedicated to the demon Azazel. The blood of the other animals would be taken into the inner sanctuary by the high priest and sprinkled there. But then he would place his hands on the head of the 2nd goat, the scapegoat, and thereby lay on it the sins of the whole people. Someone would lead the goat out of the city and into the wilderness, where it would perish, driven over the edge of a cliff. This dramatic and brutally physical action gives a glimpse of a world in which real sacrificial rituals are a vital part of managing relations between human beings and the transcendent forces which surround them. Forces which can both heal and harm. There is a powerful act of real theatre in sending the goat into the wilderness, carrying all the transgressions of the people with it, and freeing them from the burden of sin and the threat of punishment that it might bring from an agent of divine retribution. And of course, there was nothing unusual about this in the world of antiquity. Animal sacrifice was practiced throughout the ancient world of East and West, sometimes to fulfill a vow, sometimes to win a favour of the gods, sometimes, as on Yom Kippur, to achieve purification and atonement. But there was a special class of rituals around the Eastern Mediterranean at the time of Jesus, found in Egypt, Greece, and Parthia. They were called mysteries, and they did something that went much deeper into the psyche than simple transactional sacrifices. Now, it is difficult to know exactly what happened in the different mystery cults, because the initiates were usually sworn to secrecy, and so we only have fragmentary information. However, like the dramatic ritual of Yom Kippur, they seem to have offered participants a form of real theatre, in which a dramatic representation achieved what it represented for those who took part. The mysteries of Isis in Egypt and the Athenian mysteries of Eleusis were very familiar in the Hellenistic world in which Christianity emerged. Both seem to have centered around a reenactment of myths of death and rebirth. The initiate heard certain words, witnessed certain acts, and spoke certain words. They came out of the mysteries purified and renewed. This is how Lucius, the hero of the Latin novel The Golden Ass, after a series of scurrilous adventures, describes elements of his redemptive experience as an initiate into the rituals of Isis. All the non-initiates were removed to a distance. I was shrouded in a new linen garment, and the priest took my hand and led me into the heart of the sanctuary. I drew near to the confines of death and trod the threshold of Proserpina, and before returning I journeyed through all the elements. At dead of night I saw the sun gleaming with bright brilliance. I stood in the presence of the gods below and the gods above, and worshipped them from close at hand. The mystery religions seem to have spoken to a deep need for liberation and transformation, which the more everyday rituals of sacrifice could not provide. There is preparation and fasting, the practice of self-restraint, an experience of enlightenment after a journey towards personal renewal, the beginning of a new way of being in the world. It seems that the ideal of the mystery cult, as a liberating process of renewal, was familiar in Judaism at the time of Jesus. Jesus himself talks about the mysteries of the kingdom, and Paul uses the language of mystery to help his non-Jewish audience understand the Christian way. Indeed, we can perhaps glimpse a Jewish equivalent to the pagan mysteries in the writings of the Qumran communities found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. These too offered a process of initiation into a pure form of obedience to the Jewish law. A series of baptisms gradually initiated participants and purified them for a new, strict way of life, dependent on God's grace and mercy. This separated priestly community of the elect chose to live in the wilderness, away from the temple and the holy city, which they believed had been corrupted. There they awaited the time of redemption promised in the book of Daniel for the faithful remnant of God. Some scholars suggest that John the Baptist may once have been part of such a community. If that is so, then he has radically transformed the Qumran model of initiation and purification. No longer a baptism and the personal journey of renewal for the few. Now they are open to anyone who will listen, anyone who is willing to receive baptism and prepare to be saved from punishment when God finally appears to judge the earth. It is in this liberating act of real theatre at the side of the Jordan that the Gospels introduce us to Jesus. Indeed, Jesus' followers will preserve this performative symbol in their own rite of initiation, in the sacrament of baptism. So mystery is a powerful word. It implies taking part in a sacred drama of purification and transformation, of death and rebirth, a journey to enlightenment and a new way of living. It is important to know that the key Catholic word sacrament still contains important echoes of these meanings. In its Christian origins, the word sacrament was simply the Latin translation for that evocative word, mystery. Christians keep alive the dramatic dynamic of the Christian mysteries through the different seasons of the year. Each period of the liturgical year corresponds to different phases of the sacred drama of Jesus Christ. The heart of that drama, his passion, death, and resurrection, is brought to life in the seasons of Lent and Easter. The period begins with the call to repentance on Ash Wednesday. There follow 6 weeks in the personal desert, a time of purification and renewal. Time to prepare oneself like an initiate again, ready to receive the gift of new life. In the mid-20th century, the Roman Catholic Church recovered lost elements of practice from ancient Christianity, and now ends Lent with the powerful symbolism of the Easter night liturgy, the night on which new Christians will receive baptism. The family resemblance to ancient mystery cults is not an accident. The phrase awe-inspiring rites of initiation, used by the Church Fathers, borrowed the language of the mystery religions to describe the induction of new Christians into the transforming and liberating narrative of the resurrection. Ash Wednesday and Good Friday bookend the 6 weeks of preparation. They capture the more sombre aspect of the human journey with which we began. The human awareness of failure, the need for a liberation from shame and guilt, the need for freedom from the fear of punishment, the need for forgiveness and reconciliation. Each day gives us a glimpse of one of the 2 aspects of the Jewish tradition of the Day of Atonement. Ash Wednesday is a call to collective repentance, to self-discipline, preparation, acknowledgement of sin. Good Friday presents the death of Jesus not just as the Passover lamb, whose blood protects God's people from the angel of death, but as the atoning sacrifice who carries the sins of the world out into the wilderness. In the Roman Catholic tradition, the readings of the first Sunday of Lent foreground the symbolism of the wilderness. The liturgical journey of Lent first follows Jesus into the desert after his baptism, a place that evokes not just the jeopardy of life and death and the assaults of demons, but also a simplicity and dependency that purifies the relationship with God. The narrative of Jesus' temptations offers a picture of spiritual wrestling. Jesus' resolve and integrity, his very relationship with the Father, are all put to the test by Satan and grow strong in the contest, anticipating the definitive struggle of the Passion and Cross, a link explicitly made by Luke. Back in the 4th century, some Christians saw the 40 days in the wilderness as a model for lifelong imitation. They left the luxury of cities for the deserts of Egypt. They too wanted to purify their lives in the struggle to overcome the forces separating humans from God. They built on the tradition of the Lenten fast as preparation for the Easter mysteries, owning for themselves a desire to find God in the wilderness. In the monastic tradition, Lent is for this reason still called the joyful season. The desert is not for punishment, it is for training, and a training of a kind that can be recognized as a pathway to personal transformation in other spiritual traditions than Christianity and Judaism. side by side with the existential need for forgiveness from sin, for grace and mercy from God, comes an invitation to engage intentionally with the unruly self, to tame desires and grow in goodness. This is as familiar to Socrates and the Stoics in the West as to Hindu sages in the East. Mark's Gospel gives only a brief account of Jesus' time in the desert, but it adds a powerfully suggestive layer of meaning not found in Luke and Matthew. With the temptations over, Jesus is protected by angels. Now, like the first Adam, he is alone with the animals. It is here in the wilderness, with Satan driven off, that we are given the first glimpse of where the gospel journey with Jesus leads. The desert is a first stage on the way back to the innocence and freedom of the garden, back to the Eden that was lost.